beautiful and lovely to be surrounded by music. Last week we talked about Genesis and creation, and the very universe itself, with time and space as a sacred quantity, means that we are in fact surrounded by sacred music through the movement of our very earth and skies. Today we're going to talk about Exodus 1 and 2. I guess I better get this going, make that transition if you'll give me just a second. All right, great. So today we're going to talk about Exodus 1 and 2. And there are going to be some conundrums that emerge in these chapters. I do not have the definitive answers to all difficult moral conundrums. But what I want to do is open up some space for us to talk about difficult moral conundrums, because there are a number of them in this passage. It's not all difficult. Some of it we will see is heroic, faithful, and glorious. But oftentimes it is moral conundrum that exists there that provides the kind of antithesis for the heroism to emerge. And so they're necessary in a way. In this lesson, if you remember, we talked about Genesis up to Exodus 1 through 7. Who wants to remind me briefly? I said that the Jews bequeathed to the world something beautiful, a belief about God. Does anybody remember what that was called? What we called that? Ethical monotheism. Fantastic. Okay, so we had ethical monotheism. What are some components of ethical monotheism? And I will start with theism, belief in God. Mono, what does that mean? One, belief in one God. But what about the ethical part? What's that?
Moral code.
Moral codes, moral obligations. In fact, God made a beautiful world, and at the pinnacle of his creation were you and I, human beings, charged with a command from God to be fertile, increase, and fill the earth. And we saw in chapter 2 that came with some other moral obligations. In fact, for love to be truly free, that needs to be chosen. And so God gave to human creatures a choice. And ultimately, if you think about what is the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and the next to it, to love your neighbor. And so this notion of love has to come with some moral choice. Otherwise, it's compelled. A compelled love, I suppose, is kind of love, but it's not the fullest expression of the deepest love. And so God gave our ancestors, Adam and Eve, a choice. And then they fell. They made the wrong choice, but that was a free choice for them to make. And that raises the very interesting question about how evil comes into the world. But what we know through that text is that, in fact, once evil came in, it only multiplied. Very much like the leaven of things. You put a little bit in, all of a sudden it multiplies. And so it came to a point where God, the world and rotten. And so then he gave the flood as a just punishment for the world. But he found among the world a righteous man and his family, Noah. When Noah came through the ark with his family, God gave a set of new laws, new regulations. We didn't talk about these very much. There's only about 7 of them. They're called the laws or Noahide commands. But one of them was to be fertile, increase, and fill the earth. Does that sound familiar? And so Noah and his family were to repopulate the earth so that all could experience the blessings of God. Now, when we say, why did God create? I want to go back there for a second. Why did God create? He didn't have to create. He didn't have to make. As Christians, we believe that God is one God in 3 persons. There's a fancy theological term for the love is held within the Godhead. It's called perichoresis, but the idea is that effectively Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, from eternity to eternity, and in fact genuinely outside of time, have loved one another and will love one another. He does not need us in that sense, fully self-sufficient. Why then did he create? And one of the classic Christian answers to this question is effectively that God loved, and he wanted to share that love with others, freely given. And so through the idea of being fertile, multiplying, increasing, and filling the earth, the idea is that the blessing of God is going out to more and more. And what he found with the first generations is it got pretty violent. So he gave some laws, the Noahide laws. It still got a little bit violent, and he decided, the decisions of God are very interesting. I can't talk about when he decided that. He must have known it from eternity or something like that. But he chose a particular righteous man who lived in a country, in a nation full of idolatry, and yet who was not an idolater, was in fact a worshiper of the one God. And he called him out, Abram at the time, he called him out to a new place, to a new land, and he gave him some promises. And one of the promises that he gave was, I will make you a blessing for all nations. And the idea is that God is now going to work through Abraham and his descendants to provide the blessing of ethical monotheism to the world. And so when you look at the movement of the story of Genesis, you have ethical monotheism in the whole creation, Genesis 1. But then through the fall and the line of Adam and Eve, there's propagation, and God begins to work through certain channels to share his story. Goes through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel, and then we talked about how the sons or descendants of Israel, quote, sons of Israel, Israelites, ended up in Egypt. And that's where we found them in Exodus 1. And then this is fascinating. When you get to Exodus 1, I just want to take a look back at Genesis. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile, increase, and fill the earth. The man named his wife Eve, Chava, because she was the mother of all living. Chaya. Thanks. Creation then renewed through Noah. And the command to Noah, God blessed Noah. By the way, the command itself is the blessing. Notice it's not God commanded Noah. God blessed Noah. It's not God commanded them. God blessed them. Be fertile, increase, and fill the earth. As for you, be fertile and increase, swarm on the earth and increase on it. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole world branched out. You get Abraham, and then we find the children of Israel in Egypt. And tell me if any of this sounds familiar. Although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, in order to bring about the present result, the survival of numerous people. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that entire generation. But the sons of Israel were fertile, swarmed, increased, and became exceedingly numerous, so that Haaretz, the earth, or the land, was filled with them. You hear that? That resonance? The idea is that God is doing something new now. In Genesis, he had worked with individuals, Abraham, Isaac, Noah, etc. Now he's going to set off on a path to establish a nation through whom all nations could find blessing. Now, in our Christian tradition, our Christian faith, we believe that in fact, all nations are finding that blessing through the offspring, the seed of Abraham, whom we identify with Jesus. This comes straight from Paul. Any questions on that initial framing? Yes?
You mentioned, I can't remember that word, Noah's Law.
The Noahide laws.
I'm not familiar with that.
Just go back to the chapters of Genesis, around Genesis 9, where it talks about the flood. And you'll see that when he gets off of the ark, God provides some basic commands to him, which are mainly targeted at violence, mainly targeted at murder, the thing that had corrupted the earth in the first place. But not just violence against people, violence against animals too, in the sense that it says, do not alive. The idea of, like, we're going to spare our animal, we're just going to put off a leg so we can, cook the leg and eat the leg or something, but the animal's then maimed, sitting there trying to survive or something like that. So, but this is one of the corruptions that had happened prior to the flood. And so these commands are given. And these are to all human persons in the Genesis account. Okay. So the sons of Israel are found faithful. By the way, what was the sign of the covenant with Abraham? Does anybody remember that? It's hard to say out loud. Circumcision, right? Okay. Yeah, and because it was through the life-giving organ, if you will, that the increase, the fertility, the benefit, the blessings of God would then expand to all nations. And so that becomes the sign. It's not a great mystery. There's a reason that particular place is given. And the sons of Israel are found to be faithful to God's creation mandate. Egypt is not a terrible place for them initially when they go into Egypt, as I showed in the prior slide. They show up there. They're escaping famine. Joseph rescues the entirety of Egypt out of famine, and the people then multiply, and they're experiencing the blessings of God. Children, they've worked, they've played, they've prayed in Egypt for some 300 years. They have no need for a deliverer, in a sense. No need to relocate or repatriate to a homeland promised to their remote ancestors, other than the fact that it was promised. I don't imagine there was this compulsion. We must go out. We must go out. They're just living their lives. And in fact, they're experiencing the blessing of God and the bearing of children. Things were pretty good in Egypt land. But, as happens from time to time in history, the political winds change. And so then we read in the next verse, who did not know of Joseph, ascended our Egypt. Ominous music. Do you hear it? Okay. A new king who did not have the benefit of historical memory. Boy, there's a lesson. Think about that. We often hear those who fail to know history are doomed. But those who fail to know history are also doomed not to repeat its successes, because they've never seen what it is to be human in the context of time, in the context of people. So, who is this new king? Well, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. There's debate about this. There are two major views, and I don't intend to resolve them today. And I'm not the right guy to resolve them. I'm a New Testament scholar. Remember that? Scott, you remember? Okay. So I got the get out of jail card right there. But I will give you some background to these possibilities, and then we'll get to the text. And I want to leave you with a message about this that I think is helpful. So first, insider scholars like Eugene Merrill, Bruce Waltke, who advocate for what we might call the traditional or early view of the Exodus, which dates the Exodus to 1446 BC. During the 18th dynasty of Egypt, founded by a pharaoh named Amosis. So in this reading, did not know Joseph was either Amosis or his successor, Amenhotep I. And they would have been the one who policies against the Hebrews. Now, this is interesting if this is the case, because Amosis had defeated the Hyksos, who were native Semites who had moved into Egypt, and he had just defeated these Semitic, in a sense, cousins, if you will, of the Hebrews. And so that might make some sense of his new policies towards the Hebrews. And the Pharaoh of the Exodus would be Amenhotep II. That's the traditional view. Then you have the late date view, which got up here, John Collins, Kitchen. There's a number of commentators. This tends to be the more dominant view. I'm not convinced it's the right view, but it is the dominant view. Those two aren't always synonymous. They situate this around the middle of the 13th century BC. And the Pharaoh of the oppression would have been Seti the first, and then Ramses the second would have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus. If you watch King of Egypt or Prince of Egypt, this is the view, right? Ramses the second. It's not my purpose, of course, to settle the question, but I wanted to make you aware of it, and I wanted to point you to some resources in the event that you wanted to go do some research on your own. do take, however, the general approach of a man named Gordon Wenham, who wrote a commentary on the Word biblical commentary on Exodus, and he says, he follows the later date, but here's what he says, and I think it's very interesting. A shift of dating to an earlier context would have no effect on the message of Exodus, as I understand the message. And there's a kind of beauty to that. Is the Exodus history? Did a people, the Hebrew people, go out of Egypt? I think they did. And I think one of the ways we know that is because so often the words ger, sojourner, stranger, are found in the Pentateuch. Not a lot of national histories start with a people in slavery. And there are particular laws written into the legal code of Israel that talk about the sojourner, the foreigner, the alien. All of that, to me, points to a real experience that they had. Was it in 1446 or 1250? I say 1446, but I'm not the expert. All right. At the end of the day, it's conspicuous, though, that the Bible leaves the Pharaoh unnamed. We're about to see some chapters where people are named, but not the Pharaoh. And these early chapters are then about heroes that we will see, heroes of faith. Some of them very unlikely heroes of faith. But isn't that the story of God? All right, let's read Exodus 1, 8 through 11. You ready? All right, we're going to go forward. We're getting past 1, right? Okay, here we go, 1 through 11. Then a new king who did not know of Joseph ascended to power over Egypt. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are too numerous and powerful for us. Come, let's deal wisely with them, or else they will keep increasing, and in the event of war, they may join our enemies, fight against us, and rise up from the ground." And they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with their forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. He says, interestingly, to his people, not to the Egyptians. Just an observation. Could this be an indication of a new dynasty emerging or something like that? Or is he talking simply to his counselors? Perhaps. But he says this, and then he... forced to work on projects to aggrandize the new dynasty. So I want to start with a question. I'd like you to turn and talk to your neighbor and ask what motivates the new Pharaoh's actions towards the Israelite. The text is right up here. I'd like to ask you to try as best you can to stick to the text and tell me what motivates the Pharaoh's actions. All right, we got 1.5 minutes. Please find your nearest neighbor, your left, and talk about it.
Somewhere I read that the 17th dynasty were people from the outside. They weren't pure Egyptians that were in charge of it. And they, since they were foreigners, they were pretty loose on anybody else that came in the country. Mm-hmm. And when the 18th dynasty took over, there was this movement toward ethnic cleansing.
I think that's right. That's right. Okay. Let me collect some answers here. I heard some good discussion going on. I just passed through about 3 groups and just listened in. What are some answers? What motivated Pharaoh's actions? What are some things you found? Fear. Fear. Great. Fear is a great political motivator.
Lots of a cheap workforce.
Control of what? Okay, so political control or control of the people, broadly. Okay, good. The increase of the people. Okay. So the people were increasing. He does this in order to decrease the population? Is that what you think? Or to contain them as much as possible. Okay, good. So this fear is directly correlated to the growth. What was the growth? It was the blessing of God. Pharaoh's putting himself in a pretty bad spot here to become an unnamed arch rival to God. Right? He's not named. He's just now the arch enemy. He's tamping down on the blessing of God that God is giving to the Israelites, which they're doing nothing more than fulfilling the creation mandate to be fruitful, multiply, fill the haaretz, the land. Okay, anything else?
Well, this loss of control is of two things. It's control of the government and his power. The other is economic loss.
Okay.
Because if he doesn't control the Jews, they're going to do their own thing, and he's not going to. And if he doesn't oppress them, he's going to lose his cheap workforce.
Okay. So in other words, in order to have economic viability or thrive economically, he goes ahead and forces slave labor upon a group, a population. Okay, good. There are some other things here. Anybody else see some other things? Yes. War. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Oh, yeah.
He blatantly calls out in the event of war, but it's more that they would be against him because of number.
Yes. So that's an internal rising, a kind of insurrection or insurgency or something like that. There's a group internal that could threaten the existing power. We're going to tamp down on them. There's one that people don't often notice. Let's deal wisely with them. Prudence. Isn't that interesting? He seeks to do what he believes to be wise. What is the problem? It's not wise. And so this tells us that sometimes our greatest, deepest convictions, which we might couch in prudence or wisdom, might actually not be right. And so it just is another reminder to humble ourselves before the Lord and try to understand the context very broadly. But I think of this very much in terms of Genesis 2 with the serpent who's challenging Eve. And he says, it's about knowledge. Right? Did God really say, listen, his language is so interesting. Did God really say you can't eat from any tree of the garden? God didn't say that at all. But what he's done by asking that question is forced her to focus on the one tree God said you can't eat from. He's now completely changed, forced her to go there. But the idea of wisdom is a part of this. He thinks he is dealing wisely for his people. Okay.
What about the store cities?
Yes, the store cities.
Food or weapons or in anticipation?
Yes, food primarily, and perhaps weapons. I don't know about the weapons part. I know the food part. But perhaps in case of an insurrection or something like that, or a people that comes in from the outside. But his language here, rise up from the ground. What does that evoke? What is it? Swarms, like insects. They might rise up from the ground like locusts and fight with our enemies against us. And so there's just a lot going on here. And sometimes we read over this so very quickly, it's important to step back and slow down and think about his motivations. Okay. I want to focus us, before we move on to the next slide, on a particular phrase. And that is, he says to his people, and then he says to the Israelite people. The Am B'nai Yisrael. This is the only time this occurs in the Hebrew Bible that I'm aware of. And it is a particularly ethnic designation. Designation of, say, cultural norms of a people that gather together for culture, something like that. It's particularly an ethnic group. And so he has in his language pitted the ethnic Israelites against the ethnic Egyptians. And so we're looking at an example of ethnocentrism that's being worked out in the real world stage. If to control the population of the Israelites, he didn't do a great job. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And they worked the Israelites ruthlessly, and they embittered their lives with harsh service, with mortar and with bricks, and with all sorts of forced labor in the field, with all types of labors which the Egyptians ruthlessly accomplished using the Israelites. Do you see any repeated words? Ruthless, ruthlessly. Very good. And so there's this kind of interesting math that takes place. I call it the math of God's blessing. You know, if you're a mathematician, this is about as complex as my math gets, okay? Now, I have an engineering degree, by the way, but it's about this simple right now, okay? I haven't worked in engineering in forever. But Israel is oppressed, and the more they're oppressed, the more they increase and spread out. The more they fulfill the commandment of Genesis 1:28 and the commandment given to Noah. And the more God continues to bless them, despite the actions of this anti-hero, this almost anti-Christ, if you will. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fertile, increase, and fill the earth." And that's what's happening. Okay. Now, so here they are in Egypt, and they're being fertile. They're increasing. They're swarming. They become exceedingly numerous. The land was filled with them. And then the Egyptians imposed labors. Now, there's a very interesting connection that I find here to an earlier story, which some of you might be familiar with, the Tower of Babel. So I want you just to take a look there at the passages. I'll read through the one on the left. You've already looked at the ones on the right, and in common. They said to one another, "Come, bricks, and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build a city for ourselves and a tower with its top in the sky, and let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will disperse over the face of the whole earth." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the whole earth. What are some connections you see between those passages?
Embittered their lives, right? Burned bricks and all sorts of forced labor.
Yeah. Forced labor, mortar, bricks. I think you hit on them right there. Does anybody see any connections here with the Lord dispersed? Let's see. That's the wrong button. There we go. Over the face of the whole earth, right? Remember the command back in Genesis 1. Noah as well. Yes?
Seems like they only feel comfortable amongst themselves, and others are kind of ignoring the rest of God's creation.
Okay. What was happening at Babel was very interesting. God had specifically commanded the descendants of Noah to be fruitful, fertile, increase, and multiply, fill the earth. And they assembled together, lest we will disperse over the face of the whole earth. Poots. That's a great verb. Poots, disperse. It's one of those, whatever you call them, the words that sound like the onomatopoeia. Right? That's it, yeah. Okay, so they have an intention expressly not to do what God has commanded to do. We're going to gather, we're going to build vertical, we'll go up to the heavens, if you will, and we're not going to spread out. God then spreads them out. Now, what's interesting is the Israelites are doing the very opposite. They are fertile, they're increasing, they're filling the land. They are experiencing the blessing of God. And it is Pharaoh who now imposes upon them bricks and mortar to aggrandize the Egyptian state. Okay. So, the Pharaoh finds himself in fighting against God. The Pharaoh now begins a secretive campaign And the king of Egypt spoke to the midwives of the Hebrews, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. And he said, when you deliver the Hebrew women, observe the 2 stones. If it is a son, kill him. If it is a daughter, let her live. Okay. Now we have midwives of the Hebrews. And Pharaoh wants to secretively employ them on a task. You know, before the Hebrew women even figure it out, just slay that kid. Oh, sorry, he was stillborn. So basically, the midwives are to observe the sex of the child and then and kill him off. Stones. Most modern translations, I differ from them. Most modern translations will call it the birthing stones, which is some sort of stone apparatus that was used in Egypt or something like that. But I'm not alone in suggesting that that's actually just a euphemism for the testes. Now, there's one interesting thing here that the rabbis pick up, and that is the vowel in this there's one vowel in this word that's a little bit off from what you would expect in the dual form of the word. And so some people have said, well, then it's not the male testes you're supposed to observe, it's the female genitalia. And so there's all these arguments about is it the birthing stones or that. I'm convinced that it's pretty much just look at the sex of the baby and then slay them. Who are the midwives? In your mind, who are the midwives? Hebrews. What's that? Hebrews, Hebrew midwives, okay? And that is a common tradition, that these are Hebrew midwives who go before Pharaoh. I take a different view. I think these are Egyptian midwives. And I think I take what's called the construct state with this, where you translate it a certain way. Most people will translate Hebrew midwives, translate it midwives of the Hebrews, which means that they're midwives for the Hebrews. It makes no sense to me that Pharaoh would call in Hebrew midwives and say, oh, go kill all the Hebrew boys.
Why did the Egyptian midwives go against the Pharaoh?
Let's explore it. Why did the Egyptian midwives go against the Pharaoh? Okay, let's find out what their response is. But the midwives feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. By the way, this is, I'm not alone in this interpretation, okay? It goes all the way back. The earliest evidence I've found for it is 1st century with Josephus, who clearly thought these were Egyptians. Okay, so I'm in good company. If this is correct, Shiphrah and Puah were Egyptian women with responsibility to help deliver the Hebrew women, but they feared God and they didn't do that.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why did they fear God? What caused them to fear God? If they're not of the Hebrew tradition, what was it that caused them to fear God?
Text doesn't tell us. Yep.
They loved babies. They wouldn't be midwives if they didn't love babies.
But it doesn't say they love babies. It doesn't say that's why they did it.
That goes with the job.
Yep. No, I don't disagree that they probably love babies. But that's not the answer the text gives. The motivating factor for them, perhaps, is something different.
God won them over? I mean, had they lived with the Hebrews enough that their God had kind of won
I
them over?
think they were Hebrews.
You think they were Hebrews?
Because the Hebrews were very tight.
Okay.
They sort of lived together, bonded together. They did business with the Egyptians, but they didn't necessarily
Yes.
mix.
Okay. So you think it's the Hebrews, and I'm saying it's Egyptians.
Okay.
There's a difference in the interpretation of that. We know of examples of foreigners who feared God. Very broadly, if you believe that there is an eternal judge who made you, who holds your soul in his hands, there is a bit of fear with that because he owns the outcome. And I think this is very interesting. We'll talk. I'm going to keep pressing forward with this. We'll come back to the fear of God here. But look at their. Yep.
Wasn't the definition of the Pharaoh, wasn't he a god?
Yes, he was often referred to as a god. Yep, as divine. But this seems different. This isn't they feared Pharaoh or feared a god. They feared God.
So there had to have been converts, or
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. The king of Egypt summoned the midwives. We're going to keep discussing this. And said to them, just why have you done this thing and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are animals. Before the midwife comes to them, they have given birth. Now, I'm not going to comment on that yet. I want you to talk about the midwives. How did the midwives' moral courage manifest itself, and what motivated it? Let's take a minute and a half to talk together. All right, 15 seconds. All right. What motivated the Pharaoh, not the Pharaoh, what motivated the midwives? And we've already mentioned it, hinted at a few other things. Do we see anything further through our discussions? And how did their courage actually manifest itself?
They refused to kill the boy babies.
Okay, refuse to kill the boy babies. Boom, right there. Okay, good.
They were animals, and the Hebrew women had given birth already before they got there.
So they said they're like animals, and the Hebrew women have given birth already. Do they believe that? You think it's a ruse? If they're Egyptians, it's a ruse, right? Now, if they're Hebrew, oftentimes you'll get here the Hebrew women, and they're vigorous. They're just the best people on the earth. We just our ladies give birth like that, and we're healthy and strong, and that's one. We've been in the field. That's one way of understanding it. But I take this explicitly to be Egyptians, and in that case, this would be a ruse. Notice how they make the ruse. They're animals. They are feeding directly into his ethnocentrism, his racism. Right? Absolutely.
Which Bible is this from, or version is this from? Because mine said vigorous.
This is the Rutherford Bible. I told you guys in day one that I was going to do some stuff. Okay? I will only say this to my defense: I'm not alone. I don't go out on a limb entirely when I have these readings. What you're getting is a bit of an informed reading from different perspectives. And I do have a little bit of a tendency to want to push the buttons on some of the modern translations. But what I've found with modern translations, and I worked on the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so I know the process, I've been a part of it, is that there's a bit of what has been done before us. Let's look at the 6 versions. Let's look at the Hebrew. Okay, we think we know what we're doing. Do we really go out on a limb and say that? Because all these other 6 say this. And in this context, I don't have that compunction. In a Bible translation context, I might. So maybe I should talk to the midwives. Like play the scenario.
If they said that they're vigorous, if the translation is they are vigorous,
Yes.
wouldn't that be frightening to the Pharaoh? I mean, strong, vigor,
Sure.
health, all of those things. If they're animals, they're
Yep. Yeah, I specifically go this route because I do believe that they're invoking an ethnic or racial stereotype, and they're playing upon that in part to cover their own selves, but also out of the fear of God, which raises a very interesting question. Okay, you have two Egyptian women faithful to God. Can you lie when they're in the face of oppressive evil? If you were housing Jews in World War II and the Nazis showed up at your door, can you lie? Like Rahab. Okay, concealing the spies. I believe you can. Because the greater good, which has always been the strand from Genesis 1, is the preservation of life. Now, notice, he did not ask them, are you God-fearers? Which is a question of their particular religious identity, their identification with the God of the Israelites. He asked them a generic question, in a sense. Why did you do this? If in early Christianity, when you get the martyr texts, and the emperor, the Roman emperor, or a Roman magistrate says, are you a Christian? They say, Christianus sum. I am a Christian. That's a different context. Okay. As clear as I possibly can on this, I think there are occasions when that response is justifiable.
I have a question, Will.
Yes?
Athlete kind of brought this up, and now it's piquing my. How are we sure there's only two, that we're only looking at the Egyptians versus the Hebrews here? How do we know there's not like a Amitite, or another kind of group that's in there that these midwives could have been from?
Possibly so. They possibly could have been. I actually think that they're responsible. Before the midwife comes to them, they've given birth. I don't know that that's a self-reference. I think they may have been like the taskmasters appointed over others, other midwives. I mean, this is a big population. And so my sense is that they're actually ethnically Egyptian. He trusted them. And yet it's also the women's world, right? Okay, he doesn't put them to death. I'm just going to let that one alone. Okay, and now he's going to go to a different route. And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people increased and became very numerous. Look at that, the language. Increased and numerous. And because the midwives fear God, he gave them descendants. He blessed them. And here I believe we have members of the nations being blessed by the faith of Abraham. We have, in fact, the beginnings of a fulfillment already of the Abrahamic covenant. People who knew the people of God received blessing. So with his second attempt at control, unsuccessful, Pharaoh goes another route. He enrolls the entire Egyptian people into a program of genocide. He summons his people to carry out his orders to drown the Israelite boys in the Nile. Now, if you're familiar, the Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every daughter live. If you are familiar with the Jewish story, Jewish history, you are well familiar that this is a common theme among the Jews. And I've got pictures here of just several pogroms that have happened, which are kind of ethnic attacks against them. Their experience in Egypt is a kind of prototype of what has happened to them over time. Sometimes these are motivated by individual, like mobs. Sometimes they're state motivated. Sometimes they usually come in waves. So the Russian pogroms of the late 19th century came in multiple waves. Here in Nuremberg, Germany, as a kind of antecedent to the war and to the concentration camps and all of that. Okay. This is from the Night of Broken Glass. It was called Kristallnacht, which you probably know about. But for now, I want to just conclude this section with saying we've just seen two examples of Egyptian women, I believe, who feared the Lord, but there must certainly have been a great number of Egyptians who participated in the dynastic program of genocide. We will, of course, return to this subject at a later point, because I want to explore with you the idea of collective guilt. But we're not there yet. And God's judgment against the firstborn of Egypt, which I believe is also related to this. For now, though, let's wrap up another topic. I told you there's some difficult topics, and I've only got a few minutes. I can't believe this. My time management skills are going out the door, but I want to talk to you about the problem of evil. For a long time, God was silent in Egypt. The people were experiencing his blessings through the offspring of children and through work and play and music and all the good things of life. And the math of God's blessing ensured that they continued to increase even when there was a change of political policy. As long as before that the Pharaoh acted, so long as they were doing their life, it just seemed like things were normal. But then Pharaoh does this new thing and introduces a program of genocide. How are we to understand God's silence in the face of such destructive evil, where young Hebrew boys are being drowned by ethnic Egyptians? How do we comprehend the drowning death, the forced servitude, and bitter oppression of the Israelites by the Egyptian people over the course of a long period of history? Confronted with these kinds of things, the problem of evil challenges our faith. Let's just say that. There is something called the problem of evil. I want to remind you that the name Israel means to wrestle, or he who wrestles with God. And we must wrestle with these things. So I want to talk to you about the problem of evil. If God is all good, and thus desires justice, and if God is all powerful, and thus capable of destroying evil, why then does evil exist? This must mean a just, all-powerful God does not exist. It's merely a projection of your wishes. How do you respond to that? It's very difficult. What's that?
Free will.
Free will. God has permitted human choice, and if we are to allow human choice, that means the possibility of moral failure. Okay? Any other thoughts?
Since the fall, it's a broken world, really.
A fallen, broken world. I think to some extent, the most correct answer in the broad sense of things is that it will not always be thus. That there will be a time when the righteous judge of all things sets all things right. But that time is not yet. And so it raises the question, why not yet? And then I think of Romans 8 with Paul, and he talks about God working all things for the good of those who love him. And we don't understand the mysterious ways of God. I will say that there is a different problem that we also ought to wrestle with on the other side of this. Because if the atheist talks to you about this, you should talk to the atheist about the problem of meaning. Let's see if I can get it. Uh-oh. Let's look at this. It stopped working. Okay, here we go. If God does not exist, and thus the universe is the product of chance, and if chance is random, and thus has no ordering principle, how then does meaning exist? In this case, meaning does not exist as merely a projection of your wishes. That is, without God, there can be no ultimate meaning in the universe. And I find that very depressing. And just as much of a mystery as the problem of evil. But I want to say that it's even bigger than that. Because meaning is not just meaning, it is hope. It is love. It is all those immaterial aspects of your life that are not just ordered by this material body. Those things don't exist either if you don't believe in God. Why do we as human persons even feel like we have the right to make meaning? Because we see in the world around us order, even if not perfect order. We see order, which suggests to us that there is one who orders. And we saw that in Genesis 1. The Creator who orders all things. Okay. I would say in this world we affirm there's no perfect justice. But justice will be perfected in the world to come when Christ fills all in all. I think I want to move on to the next chapter and probably just deal with the first episode. So I think we're about to run out of time. Okay. In the crucible of Egypt, where a nation is being born, and where Hebrew midwives are doing more than birthing young Hebrew boys, they're birthing a nation of God's blessing. There are voices of faith and faithfulness. Unnamed sometimes and named other times. We've seen Shiphrah and Puah. Now we see an unnamed man and woman, Levites, who marry and have a child. She bears a son, unnamed. But she also is a good mother who loves her son, sees the evil around her, and she does her very best to protect him. At the end of the day, she comes up with a plan. I'm going to put him in a wicker basket, right? No, I'm going to put him in an ark. It's the same word. It's the only other time it occurs. I'm going to allow God to rescue him through the waters. And maybe he'll be a savior of his people. Think of the faith she must have had. Place the child in the ark, which is it is a wicker basket, but the terminology is specific. And she placed it among the reeds of the bank of the Nile, and his sister is there too. What does that tell you about her? Faithful. These are women expressing incredible heroism in the face of genocide. And they're doing everything they can to preserve life when you have an evil man who is trying to destroy it. And it is an evil man who has implicated his entire people. I don't mean that to say that man is evil or something like that. I mean that to say one individual person has done so much damage. And yet we see individual heroism. And I'll end with this part because we're drawing to a conclusion. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe in the Nile. Her attendants are walking on the bank. She sees the basket among the reeds. Saw it. A little boy crying. That's how excited the text is. You see it. And she took pity, and this is one of the Hebrew boys. She took pity. Here you have a humanitarian living among her father's house. Wow. His sister runs up. Shall I go fetch a nurse for him?
I got the right one.
I've got just the one. Just the one. And she does. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the girl went and called the child's mother. And she even offered to pay the wages. I'm going to end with this slide, which is a painting on a Jewish synagogue in Syria called Dura Europos, which was painted around the middle of the 3rd century. And it is, you can see, Miriam and Yocheved, Moses' mother, delivering the child, Pharaoh's daughter discovering the child. And then, I don't know about this, I think this might either be Pharaoh or maybe this is Moses grown up. I'm not sure how to interpret that one. But it exists in the artistry because there is a thing of beauty to the faith of these individuals in the context of oppression. And I pray that you too have that kind of faith when courage demands it of you and when God demands it of you. Thank you.